Welcome to Libertas Europae. It seems like these days everyone is talking about Greta Thunberg, and although this topic is a bit off the beaten path for this channel, I'm making this video because I'm annoyed that 95% of what people talk about her and the issues she brings up is just complete nonsense. And it falls into two camps. Either it's just fawning adoration, or it's some sort of wild theory about how climate change is actually caused by sunspots or whatever. And by now probably you've all seen the clip of her angry speech at the UN summit.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
And Greta is right. She shouldn't be there. She should be back in Sweden, back in school. And what I'm going to do in this video is to explain why she in good conscience can go back to school and why she should go back to school. Now, I'm not a climate change denier, whatever that means. I believe that the evidence for man-made climate change is very strong, but the evidence for these kinds of apocalyptic claims is virtually non-existent.
We live in a strange world where the United Science tells us that we are about 11 years away from setting off an irreversible chain reaction way beyond human control that will probably be the end of our civilization as we know it.
Claims like these are not science. They're just sensationalist scaremongering. Now, before we go any further, I want to offer a disclaimer. Just like Greta, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert, I'm just a reasonably well-informed layman. So let's look at what the actual experts have to say. So current global temperatures are about 0.8 degrees Celsius higher than the pre-industrial average, and all the future numbers you're going to hear in this video about global warming are going to be in this format. It's degrees Celsius and compared to the pre-industrial average. So according to the IPCC in the special report they put out recently, link is down below, if you want to limit warming to about 1.5 degrees, what we need to do is to reduce global net CO2 emissions by about 45% compared to the 2010 levels by around the year 2030, and we need to reach net zero emissions by about 2050. Now, net zero means that the total amount of CO2 emitted by human activity is equal to the total amount of CO2 removed by human activity. And this is where the whole meme about the world ending if we don't do anything by 2030 comes from. This sort of idea that the world is going to end in 12 years or 11 years or whatever. Now, there's something special about the year 2030. There's nothing special about 1.5 degrees. And this special report that the IPCC put out about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees doesn't even try to justify this 1.5 degree target on economic grounds. It doesn't do any sort of cost-benefit analysis. It's just taken for granted that we want to reduce warming to 1.5 degrees. But according to William Nordhaus, who is the leading authority on the economics of climate change, basically invented that field, and is also the recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize for his work on that subject, the costs of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century are actually much higher than the benefits. So according to Nordhaus, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is much worse than doing nothing. So this is a table from a 2009 article by economist Robert Murphy, but it's based on numbers from Nordhaus's model from his 2008 book that's also referenced down below. So what Nordhaus is doing here is comparing several different policies to deal with climate change. So the first one is the baseline of doing nothing, and everything is compared to that. Then we have Nordhaus's optimal tax, that's the best possible policy that Nordhaus recommends, would be a global carbon tax. And then there's also various other models. So when it's limiting CO2 to 560 parts per million in the atmosphere, and various other policies, including here the policy of limiting the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And also keep in mind that 1.5 degrees means 1.5 degrees compared to the pre-industrial average. So it means only an additional 0.7 degrees compared to where we are now. So according to Nordhaus's model, we would be, compared to doing nothing, $3.07 trillion better off if we adopted his optimal tax model. Now that sounds like a huge number, but you have to keep in mind that this is for the entire world and for the rest of the century. And this is given in a present discounted value. This is a method that economists use to compare cash flows across time. So the way this works is that you apply a discount rate. I believe the one that Nordhaus is using is 4%. So what this means is that if you have a benefit or a cost that occurs 1 year from now, it will be discounted by 4%. So you take the benefit or the cost and you divide it by 1.04. Or if it happens in 10 years, then you divide by 1.04 to the 10th power. If it happens in 50 years, you divide by 1.04 to the 50th power, and so on. And this is a way of comparing different payments, different cash flow structures across time. This is a standard model that economists use, but there isn't any real philosophical justification for using exactly this model. The reason economists use that is just basically because it's easy to calculate. And there's also no particular strong justification for using a particular discount rate. So Nordhaus is using 4%, but you might as well use 2% or 3% or 5% or 7% or something else. And the choice of discount rates matters a lot if you're talking about costs that are going to occur far into the future. So the lower the discount rate is, the worse climate change is going to look, because the worst damages are going to occur far into the future, many decades into the future, so they're going to be discounted by a lot if you have a high discount rate, whereas with a low discount rate, they matter a lot more. So with Nordhaus's optimal solution, we still have a $17.31 trillion of environmental damages, but his policy is fairly cheap. It only costs $2.2 trillion to implement, probably mainly in terms of reduced output, because we can't use fossil fuels as much because of their tax. And so the sum of the damage and the costs is $19.52 trillion. So the difference between this $19.52 trillion and the $22.59 trillion in the baseline is the gain of $3.07 trillion that we get with Nordhaus's optimal tax according to his model. And if you look down here to the 1.5 degrees Celsius condition, here we actually have a very, very large negative. So limiting our CO2 emissions to get the temperature growth down to 1.5 degrees Celsius would impose such severe cost on the economy that the damage from that would be much more than the actual damage from just not doing anything about climate change. So in this model, we actually lose $14.44 trillion. So at least according to Nordhaus's model, the people who were clamoring for a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit are much more wrong-headed than the people who want to do nothing about climate change. Now, these numbers are more than a decade old, and things have changed a little bit since then. Nordhaus's updated version of his model has a higher social cost of carbon. That is, he thinks that the damage from global warming will be a bit higher than what he estimated back then. But even according to the current version of his model, the optimal policy would still allow for about 3.5 degrees of warming. So here's a graph from a working paper that NOTAS put out in 2016 and updated in 2017, which shows the temperature change in these 4 different scenarios. So the highest one, the gray one, is the base scenario where we don't do anything. The blue line is the optimal tax that NOTAS proposes, which would allow temperature to rise to 3.5 degrees Celsius. And we have 2 more models here that would limit the temperature to below 2.5 degrees of temperature rise. And these policies, according to NOTAS, are significantly worse than his optimal policy. So in this paper, he doesn't even compare the 1.5 degree limit, because that, according to him, is just completely dumb and unrealistic. It's not going to happen, and we wouldn't want it to happen. So he just compares this to a 2.5 degree rise, and he thinks even that is too aggressive. So this whole idea that people like Greta are just repeating mainstream science is nonsense. Science does not support any sort of extremely aggressive action on climate change. And what's often forgotten in this whole climate change debate is that global warming also has significant positive effects. It should be rather obvious, but I do have to point it out. If things get warmer, if the climate warms up, that's going to have positive effects and negative effects. And yes, global warming means there's going to be more heat-related deaths, but it's also going to mean fewer cold-related deaths. And a lot more people die from cold than die from heat. Yes, global warming is going to mean that the sea levels rise and we're going to lose some land to sea level rise, but it also means that due to the higher temperatures, land that is currently uninhabitable because it's too cold will become habitable. There'll be lots of land in places like Canada or Russia that are currently virtually uninhabited because they're too cold, which, if temperatures rise, will become habitable. So global warming can have a lot of effects, and economists try to figure out how to add up all these positives and negatives, but any of these calculations are just fraught with problems. We already talked about the discount rate, which is a way of comparing costs and benefits across time, which is hugely problematic. That's also just a general problem of trying to do interpersonal comparisons of utility. So economists try to convert all these intangible things like health and clean air and good weather and whatnot into numbers, into dollars and cents, and then they try to add all that up. But philosophically speaking, that's very, very dubious. It implies a sort of crude utilitarianism that most people don't believe in. And it also involves things like estimating the chances of some sort of future disaster. And we don't really have any sort of reliable numbers. We have no idea how likely various worst case scenarios about climate change are. These are essentially just completely made up numbers. They're just educated guesses at best. And these guesses matter a lot. And it also matters a lot what kind of benefits you include. And so there's a lot of degrees of freedom for researchers who try to calculate something like the social cost of carbon. And if you just tweak some of the variables a little bit, you can just hugely change the outcome, which is why there's so many different numbers out there to try to estimate the social cost of carbon. It's not even clear at all that the costs are going to outweigh the benefits of climate change. And if you look at history, because this is after all a journal about history, warm periods have generally been times of human flourishing, and cold periods have tended to be times of decline and collapse. So geologically speaking, we are currently in an ice age. An ice age, geologically defined, is a period which is cold enough that the poles are permanently covered in ice. And for much of Earth's history, the Earth has been so hot that glaciers just didn't exist. The current ice age started roughly 2.6 million years ago. And during this ice age, there are very cold glacial periods and there are somewhat warmer interglacial periods. We're currently in an interglacial period called the Holocene, which started about 11,700 years ago. And human civilization and the beginnings of agriculture and village life is all started in the early Holocene when it got warmer. And if you look at historical time, Rome flourished during what's called the Roman warm period, which lasted from roughly 250 BC to AD 400. And right after the end of this period, the western half of the empire started to collapse. And Europe recovered from this collapse during the so-called medieval warm period, which lasted from roughly 950 to 1250. Of course, this doesn't prove anything. These pre-industrial societies are very different to today's society, and just because warmer temperatures were generally better in previous times doesn't mean that they're going to be today or in the future. But it should at least give us pause. So we should be very skeptical when some sort of scientist or economist tells us that he's got it all figured out, he's thrown all the numbers into his model, and what the model spits out is that the optimal carbon tax is going to be $52.37 per ton of CO2 or something like that. That's not science, that's just speculation, that's just guesstimates. Now the people who make these models, people like Nordhaus, they're very much interested in trying to show that climate change is a big problem because that's their job. If they put out a model that shows climate change is not actually a problem, actually the social cost of carbon is negligible or negative, well, it's not going to be good for their careers. Nordhaus has built his career on this idea of being the economics of climate change guy. He's done other work, of course, but that's the big thing he's known for. That's the thing he got the Nobel Prize for. So there's going to be a bias towards overestimating the costs and underestimating the benefits of climate change. I'm not saying that Nordhaus at all are frauds or that they're dishonest or anything like that, but they are naturally going to be biased. And when we have so many degrees of freedom, there's lots and lots of areas where this bias can creep in. But even so, if you take all these models at face value, climate change is not going to be a huge civilization-ending catastrophe. If Nordhaus is right, there are going to be significant damages, but there honestly isn't all that much we can do. Because even the best mitigation scheme is only going to make things slightly better. And a bad mitigation strategy, like trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, is going to be much, much worse than doing nothing. So the takeaway message here is that the house is not on fire. There's no need to panic. Climate change is an issue we're going to have to deal with, but millenarian rhetoric won't help anyone. Greta's aggressive and accusatory rhetoric towards the older generations is disrespectful and entirely unwarranted. Sure, today's adults and the generations that preceded them have made plenty of mistakes, who hasn't, but then they've also done a lot of things right. Not only is the house not on fire, the house is better than ever. The house, which used to be just a wooden cabin and before that a mud hut, is now built of solid brick. It has plumbing, none of those lead pipes either. It has warm running water, it has central heating, it has air conditioning, it has internet access and all sorts of modern amenities. Or if you drop the metaphor, most people, for most of human history, lived on about $3 a day per person. And that is, by the way, adjusted for purchasing power. That is, people consumed only about as much as you could buy for $3 today. And just imagine what your life would be like if you had to live on so little. And then, over the last 200 years, a miracle happened. The European miracle, which I talked about in my first video, linked up here. And now we're all rich and everything is amazing. Well, not everything. Along the way of this massively beneficial fundamental restructuring of society and the economy, we've also run into some ecological problems. It's been pollution, deforestation, smog, depletion of the ozone layer, climate change. These are all serious problems, and I'm not trying to downplay them, but we do have to keep them in perspective. Someone born in Europe in the 21st century is incredibly lucky. There's no better time to be alive, except maybe in the future. And the reason everything is so great today is because of these previous generations that Greta and her supporters revile. So how about some freaking gratitude to the people, past and present, who have built this amazing civilization, who've made us also incredibly rich. Greta's attacks on her elders and similar misanthropic rhetoric is especially unfair because it ignores all the game theoretic problems that we have with solving climate change through reducing CO2 emissions. No country has so far done much about climate change because it is in no country's interest to do so, because there's a massive free rider problem. Even if restricting CO2 emissions is economically efficient from a global perspective, almost certain to be a huge net loss for any one country because they would massively hurt their own economy for a benefit that would be shared by the entire world. And devising any sort of international agreement to overcome this free rider problem is extremely difficult because it's in every country's interest to promise as little as possible and to keep even less. And free riding is especially tempting here because if some countries reduce their carbon footprint by using less fossil fuels, the reduced demand for fossil fuels will put downward pressure on prices, which makes fossil fuels more attractive to those who don't sign up to the climate agreement. And if Notar's numbers are roughly correct, then the gains from even this perfect policy are fairly modest. And in practice, the implementation of the policy is not going to be anything remotely close to perfect. And so you don't need many countries to defect before the gains disappear altogether. So blaming humanity for not solving this more or less insoluble problem is about as stupid as blaming people for not being able to fly by flapping their arms. Just flap harder. Humans fly by building planes and helicopters and rockets, not by flapping their arms. Similarly, humans will deal with climate change through technological means, not through magically getting all the countries of the world on board with decarbonization. We don't know what these future technologies would look like. Prediction is hard, especially about the future. Maybe we'll invent some new efficient and clean form of energy that will make fossil fuels obsolete. Maybe fusion, maybe something altogether different. Maybe we'll develop forms of carbon dioxide removal that are cheap enough that the free ride problem no longer matters very much. At the very least, we can use known mitigation techniques such as air conditioning or building dams to protect against higher sea levels. The Dutch have been doing that for centuries. Just imagine what would have happened if the Wright brothers and other pioneers of flight, instead of tinkering with the machines, had become aviation activists who went around shouting at people to flap their arms harder, flap harder, flap harder. You're not flapping hard enough. We need smart people like Greta and the millions of children that she has inspired to get a proper education so that they will be able to work on the future technologies that will actually solve climate change. So no one has stolen Greta Thunberg's childhood. The world is not ending in 11 years. There is still plenty of time to grow up and live a normal life. So, what do you think about Greta Thunberg? Is she the Messiah or is she a very naughty girl? Tell me down in the comments. If you haven't done so already, please take a second to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell button so you will be notified when I post future videos. And until next time, goodbye.